recently I reread, or rather re-listened to, because it was an audiobook. It's a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Of course, you have to say it in that voice because it was an audiobook and it just sounded so cool how the guy talks. It was like cotton candy to your earlobes. It felt good. So I finished this book. I actually listened to it with Liz as we were on a road trip recently. And it's such a good book. Now, when you hear the title, it sounds kind of manipulative. How to Win Friends and Influence People. Yeah, but I have employed so many of these techniques, as he calls them, to win friends and influence people, to make people like me. Now that statement right there is very, very manipulative, because you're like, whoa, you're making people like you. That's just so uncool. Let me sum up this book. Don't be a selfish jerk. That's really it. It's like, just take care of the other person and they'll be friends with you. They will allow themselves to be influenced when you are taking care of their needs, when you're not just looking after yourself. So there you go. It's a really, really cool book, and some of the major lessons that I got out of it was talk in terms of what the other person wants to talk about. That doesn't mean that you never talk about yourself. No, of course you can. I do that every day. Probably a little too much. But the importance of listening, and actively listening, not just saying, yeah, actively listening, engaging, being genuinely interested in them. And once you are actually interested in something, show your appreciation for that. Admire them, or admire what they say, as long as it's genuine. And that's another huge lesson in this book, is don't stoop to flattery. Like, I'm so happy for you. How often do you hear that? That's flattery. That's so shallow. Very, very rarely is anybody truly, actually, literally happy for you. They may be happy in general, but happy for you, it's just a really weird phrase. Try to use something else, okay? But anyway, I digress. Don't flatter someone. Genuinely show your praise. Be lavish with your praise and hearty with your admonition. That's from the book. This book was written in 1936, which is really, really interesting to hear the author refer to figures like Rockefeller or Roosevelt, and even Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And as he looks at hundreds upon hundreds of biographies of successful people and how they dealt with people, and that is, they listened, they admired people, they smiled. I know that's kind of a weird technique to employ, but smile. Just smile. You don't believe how many people, when they get nervous, they just like, and they're just these cold-hearted people. It's like, come on, smile. Names. That's a huge eye-opener right there. Someone's name is the most beautiful sound that they will ever hear. So when you meet someone, remember their name. And I can guarantee you that every person listening to this will instantly say, I'm so bad with names. That's because everybody says that. You're not bad with names. You're just too lazy to remember the name. Seriously, I thought that about myself for the longest time. For the longest time. Whoa. Wow. Okay, music break. But seriously, when someone introduces themselves, I will almost physically squint, which is kind of funny when they're introducing themselves. Here I am. But physically squint to try to remember their name. It's a very, what's the word? Purposeful, that's the right word. It is a very purposeful decision I am making at that moment. Whenever someone introduces themselves, I think, I am going to remember this person's name. And now there are very few tricks to employ to remember someone's name, and that is, you associate their name with what they do. Find something interesting that they do and repeat it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until there's, you know it. Sometimes, especially when I'm at like a social gathering or something and I've met like 12 people in a row, I will excuse myself, and now this is really weird, I will excuse myself and write out their names on my iPhone. I've done this several times. I will look at their names and then delete it. Sometimes I'll wait until I get home, and then I'll re-look at the names, associate the interesting things with their faces with the names, and then I will delete it. Napoleon actually did this, very successful man. He would write the names down on a piece of paper, look at it, memorize it, and then he'd shred it up and throw it away. And because of that, these successful people know thousands of people's names. And the reason why you do this is because it's so meaningful. And I get this too. It's so meaningful when you haven't seen someone in months and they say, "Hi, Beau." It's like, whoa, they remember my name. That's just so cool. And I want to be that kind of person to remember people's names. Now, with that being said, I am not perfect. And I have, apologized and been like, look, I'm so sorry. I know we are Facebook friends. I know you've commented on some of my stuff, but I run into them at Safeway and I'm just like, I completely forget your name. Sometimes Liz is really nice and she introduces herself so that I'm like, oh, of course, that's Kyle. I know Kyle so well. So, yes, there are moments when I'm very ashamed with myself. But anyway, really actively try to remember people's names.